Okay, now would be a good time to get started then. Let's see. Okay, welcome again to our pre-National Legislative Summit webinar, where we talk about not just what's going on at the federal level, but we're also going to talk about how to prepare for NLS. And so I'm Genesis Santiago. I'm the Senior Government Relations Associate, and with me is Jose Miranda. He's the Director of Government Relations. And again, together, we're going to talk about preparing for NLS. So on today's agenda, and I already alluded to this, we're going to give a very quick federal update. We're also going to talk about the key factors in the 119th Congress. So what's going to happen starting January? We're going to talk about the key factors for the administration. So the new administration that is entering in January. And then, of course, a very basic preparation timeline that covers December, January, and February. And again, we're covering how to best prepare for NLS. Okay, so let's get started with our federal update. So as we all know, November elections have come to their conclusion, and so the results are in. And so what we have now is a Republican trifecta with a Trump White House, a Republican majority in the House, and a Republican majority in the Senate. And so what that means is that we're going to see a freshman class of 82 new members of Congress. And so that's going to include 14 new members and 68 new representatives. For those of you that are counting, that actually includes the 5 members of Congress that are going to vacate their seats. So, for instance, we have Marco Rubio, who has been nominated by former President Trump and President-elect Trump to be his Secretary of State and a few others. So again, that 60 includes those 5 representatives that are going to vacate their seats. And so not only are we going to have a brand new freshman class of 82 members along with returning members, but we're also going to see a few shifts in congressional leadership. And so what we mean by that is that we're going to see a new Senate Majority Leader, and he is John Thune from South Dakota. We're also going to have Senator Bill Cassidy from Louisiana as the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee Chair. Susan Collins, she's going to take the chairmanship again for Appropriations Committee. And one thing that we're keeping an eye on, our eyes on, is the chairmanship for the Education and Workforce Committee. And so right now we have Representatives Burgess Owens from Utah and Tim Walberg from Michigan. They're both vying for that chair position. And so we expect votes to take place this week. And once we get the results of that, we'll be sure to put that in our following law alert. Okay, so a few things to keep in mind, and those of you that joined us during our Congress, we did talk about this. So one thing that we are constantly talking about is passing a fiscal year 2025 funding package. So some of you may know that the deadline for the federal government to fund the following fiscal year, the deadline is December 20th, so 10 days from now. What we expect, however, is that we're going to get an extension. And so what's unclear is if this extension will run through January or if it's going to run through March. And so I suppose time will tell when the extension will go into. Uh, another highlight would be the reauthorization of the Workforce and Innovation Opportunity Act, also known as WIOA. And so what we know so far is that it's reaching its final stages. And so what that means is that we have both Republicans and Democrats from the House Education and Workforce Committee and the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. We have, as they say, the 4 corners come together and they've agreed to a negotiated package or negotiated bill. Um, so it is approaching the finish line. So we're waiting to see if this bill will go on the floor for a vote. There are some people, however, that are a little bit skeptical on its passage and its viability. So here at ACCT, we're keeping our fingers crossed and hoping that it does meet the finish line. Another thing that we're looking at would be the National Defense Reauthorization Act and, of course, the Farm Bill. And those are things that are still pending. Our expectation with the Farm Bill is that it will receive a 1-year extension.
And if I can jump in real quick, Genesis, just to add a little bit of context, particularly around WIOA, this Senate and House compromise legislation that was introduced, what, maybe 2 weeks ago, and that is currently going through the process in the Senate to figure out if they're able to put it on the floor or attach it to a moving legislative vehicle, includes some of our priorities that we've been advocating for several years now, namely the authorization of the strengthening community college training grants. As you may or may not be aware, SCCTG is the only federally funded program that is dedicated specifically to build the capacity of community colleges in the workforce. But it's a program that was started through appropriations. It's gone through, I think this would fiscal year 25 would be its fifth round of funding if that whenever that law gets passed. And it has not been included in WIOA because it was established after the last reauthorization. So we have been asking Congress to include it to firm up its standing and make sure that it's not subject to potential cuts or eliminations moving forward. That's one thing. And of course, with the Farm Bill, which, as Genesis stated, is likely to get an extension for another year. We'll be following it closely for some of our key priorities, including making it easier for eligible students to access SNAP in an effort to combat food insecurity. And of course, getting that small new program focused on workforce development, capacity building for agricultural industry sector jobs at our institutions. But as Genesis mentioned, this is all up in the air. We know NDA is going to get a vote in the House this week. Everything else is still up in the air with only 10 days left before the end of the current continuing resolution that is funding the federal government.
Right, exactly. Okay, so in terms of movement, when we're thinking about the administration, so we know that President-elect Trump is right now in the process of selecting his cabinet. And so here's some of his nominees. So we have Linda, sorry for the typo there. So we have Linda McMahon. She has been nominated as Secretary of Education. Lori Chavez de Reamer has been nominated for Secretary of Labor, Howard Lutnick, Secretary of Commerce, and Kelly Loeffner, Small Business Administrator. And so, of course, we are going to continue tracking what the developments are with the nomination process and of course, the confirmation process as we move into January.
Thanks, Genesis. Now looking ahead to the 119th Congress, which will officially start on January 3rd of 2025, we can expect a very busy year, especially with, as Genesis stated, having a government trifecta on the Republican side, having the majorities in both chambers and in the White House. They will want to align their priorities, much like they did 8 years ago in 2017, to move certain key legislations. One of those, this is going to sound very familiar, will be on tax. So back in 2017, when Republicans had the last time they had a trifecta, they moved through reconciliation, which I will touch on shortly. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that was the major signature piece of legislation of President Trump's first year. It was an overhaul of our tax code, but many of those provisions during that law are expiring next year. And so President Trump has requested, he wants to see those expiring provisions extended. It is a question mark on whether they're going to take a scalpel approach and just extend certain provisions, or his preference would be to just extend the entire law. The big question around it is whether they will have the votes. As we've mentioned, they do have the majorities, but they do have somewhat slim majorities. And there will be some members in Congress who will be concerned about the price tag of extending these tax provisions. In addition to that, there will be other provisions related to tax that may be embedded into these conversations that have come up since 2017. Regardless, 2025 is likely to be a big year on tax policy, and this presents a great opportunity for us as community college advocates to to fight to include one key tax policy provision that we have been asking for several years, which has bipartisan support, but unfortunately has never had the momentum or the legislative vehicle in the last recent years to move forward, and that would be the Tax-Free Pell Act. For awareness, currently under law, any amount of the Pell Grants that a student receives, if they are used for tuition purposes, then they are not taxable. But if they are used for non-tuition purposes, if they're used for cost of attendance purposes, then that share of the grant is then taxable. This is not an issue this is an issue that's primarily for our sector, because in most four-year institutions, tuition itself eats up the entirety of the Pell Grant. But for our institutions who have done an incredible job of maintaining affordable tuition rates with an average national average of around $4,000, that means that there's $3,000 if you are a Max Pell recipient receiving $7,000. There's about $3,000 that then you are on the hook for paying taxes on because you are using it for housing, transportation, food, and so forth. And so this has been a big ask for several years. And I think next year presents a really good opportunity for us to advocate on this issue to the Ways and Means Committee, to the Senate Finance Committee, and to all our legislators to ensure that this gets included in whatever tax package moves forward next year. Now, I alluded to reconciliation. Um, and reconciliation for awareness is a budgetary mechanism that allows a funding package that is not subject to the Senate filibuster. As you all may know, in the Senate, in order for a law to move, it has to move in a bipartisan manner, in large part because of the filibuster. Essentially, what that means is that any piece of legislation in the Senate has to have 60 votes approving it in order to move forward. Um, it's been a long time since any one party had a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. The Republicans will have a 53-seat majority, so it's higher than what the Democrats have had during this last Congress, but it's still short 7 votes of a filibuster-proof majority. What that means is that they will need to have Democratic input in some pieces of legislations. However, with reconciliation, that takes that issue away. Reconciliation makes it so that a simple majority in both chambers is all that's needed to pass legislation. That being said, reconciliation is a very tricky piece of legislation. Not everything can apply to reconciliation because it's meant to be a budgetary tool. It's supposed to be a tool that either ideally decreases the government deficit, or makes changes to federal programs that impact the budgetary outlays of federal programs, whether it's money coming in or taxes or cuts to programs and so forth. And so back in 2017, Republicans used reconciliation to pass their Tax Cuts and Jobs Act because they did not have Democratic support on a lot of those proposals. We can expect the same thing to happen this coming Congress, where Republicans will want to move key policy priorities that Democrats will not align with. The extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act may be one of them, but there's other policy issues that the President-elect Trump, as well as leadership in the Senate and the House have mentioned, namely border security, national defense. And so the way that reconciliation works is that the first thing that needs to happen is that Congress needs to pass a budget resolution with instructions to different committees in both chambers to say, we want to set this budgetary goal, whether it's reduction of the deficit or changes in the budget. And in order to do that, we need to change this law, or we need to cut these programs. And so the committees then draft the legislation aimed towards those goals. So with reconciliation, anything that goes there has to have a budgetary lens. And while rules are sometimes bent in Congress, this is one that so far in the Senate has been very strict, because the Senate parliamentarian can review any policy provision that's included in a reconciliation bill that may be subject to what is called as the Byrd Rule, which essentially says you cannot have extraneous policy language that does not have a direct impact on the budget. And so the options for Republicans will be limited, but they will still try to draft two reconciliation bills, one using fiscal year 2025, because that Congress did not pass a fiscal year 2025 budget resolution this year. They're able to then use that next year for the first reconciliation bill. And then the second one would be when they pass a fiscal year 2026 budget resolution later in the year. So we can expect the first year of Congress to be very busy on at least these two reconciliation bills, very much like how Democrats, when they controlled the trifecta at the start of the Congress prior, also passed two reconciliation bills, one of them which eventually became the Inflation Reduction Act. A couple of other things to keep an eye out for next Congress and with the new administration is what changes are going to happen on the regulatory side. Much like what happened from the Obama administration to the Trump administration and from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, we can expect to see a lot of regulatory whiplash. Top of mind for our institutions, top three areas that we can expect to see a complete 180 is on Title IX, gainful employment, and on student loan relief. On Title IX, you'll recall that during the Obama era, there were dear colleague letters that governed Title IX regulations. When President Trump came into office and he appointed Secretary DeVos, Secretary DeVos then resigned those dear colleagues and went through a regulatory process to draft new Title IX rules. Those took effect while the president was in office, and then when President Biden came into office and he nominated Secretary Cardona to lead the department, they resigned the DeVos era Title IX regulations and went through their own regulatory process to draft those new rules, which are currently in place, but technically are only enforceable in about half of the states right now because through litigation, the enforcement of the new Title IX rules have been put on hold in at least half of the states. We can expect President Trump to probably reverse the Biden era Title IX rules and either go back to something similar to the DeVos era Title IX rules or do something new with potential Secretary McMahon being in charge of drafting the new rules. On gainful employment and financial value transparency, this is another area where we've had a lot of backlash from the Obama era to the Trump era to the Biden era. The Biden's gainful employment and financial value transparency rule has been in place since July 1st of this year. However, reporting deadlines have been pushed back in large part due to what happened with the FAFSA rollout fiasco and how the people that were in charge of reporting the information for gainful employment were essentially the same people that were working on the FAFSA in our colleges. The final reporting deadline was pushed to January 15th. So our colleges are still expected to submit the data under this rule. However, that deadline is only 5 days before President Trump takes office. So it's unclear what's going to happen with that data, if it's even going to be made public. But the Biden administration has said that they will not delay the deadline any further, especially because they know that they will no longer have access to that data after January 20th. And then on student loan relief, as you all know, this was one of President Biden's key policy goals, and over the last several years, tried to provide debt relief to different groups of borrowers. Most of those efforts were challenged and blocked in the courts, and even the current plans around the SAVE plan, repayment plan, income-based repayment plan, or the financial hardship student loan relief rule that they published, those are still currently challenged in the courts as well. We can expect President Trump to reverse all of these decisions. They probably will want to mark their own stamp on some kind of income contingent repayment plan, but we know that that's not really what they were focused on in the first administration. In fact, even with public loan forgiveness, the approval rates during his administration were significantly low, and that was the first time that the first cohort of borrowers would have been eligible for it. So we're not sure what's going to happen, but we can expect that they will not be putting so much effort into student loan debt relief as the Biden administration has. Um, we're gonna stop there on some key on the federal update part, mostly because we're trying to provide just like high level, this is what's gonna happen. A lot of things are still up in the air. The Senate will have to confirm President Trump's nominees. We have to figure out what is or isn't going to happen before the end of this Congress legislatively to figure out what do we have to continue advocating for in the next Congress and what can we check off, which I really hope we can at least check off WIOA. But as Genesis alluded, there's broad bipartisan support, but there are a couple of holdouts who have concerns or who have holds for particular um, policy issues or policy priorities that they like to see included that may not have been included due to the nature of compromise. Um, and there's also the question on whether there will be a legislative vehicle and enough legislative days to get it through the finish line. But there's still a lot up in the air. There's still a couple of weeks for Congress to deliberate and make decisions, and then we'll have to get started and figure out what the new majorities will decide to do and how quickly they will move through the nomination process or the confirmation process for President Trump's nominees, who will then start working on the regulatory agenda for the new administration. But let's turn over now to what can you do as prospective Annalise attendees? What should you be doing now, and how can we best prepare? We've sort of broken down this presentation into the three segments: December, January, and February. The first things that you need to do, especially if you are a newer trustee or if you've seen significant change in your college, whether it's with new programs or if you've seen significant change in your community, is familiarizing or refamiliarizing yourself with your institution and with your community, looking at what are some of the key signature programs that you have those changed over the last year or more, looking at what are some of the needs that the community is seeing now, whether that's on workforce or on different opportunities that are coming to the community or different opportunities that have arisen from the state legislature, thinking through what federal programs are helping your institution or helping your students. And then how are your constituents being assisted by your member of Congress, whether it's, and this is not just institution specific, but also, we alluded to students who are food insecure. Are they being able to access the SNAP program, or does your campus have different resources for them to do it? Does your institution partner with other agencies to make sure they have information and so forth? As Genesis mentioned, we have about 82 new members of Congress coming up, 14 in the Senate, 68 in the House. Make sure that you know if your congressperson is new. It may be one of the new people. To my knowledge, this should not longer be an issue at this point in 2025, but even if it's on a new member, some of the congressional districts may have been redrawn. I know in some states that has been a prolonged battle since the last census because of state legislatures and court challenges. So just making sure that that you know who is the person that's representing your college, but also is there a different person that represents where your students are coming from? Is there a student, there's some different person that represents where you reside? All of that is a good information to have so that you can leverage that for when you request meetings. Going into January, this is when you should really start doing pen to paper and preparing for everything. You should start requesting meetings. You could actually do it now if you wanted to, requesting meetings with your federal legislators. But there's a chance that they will not see it if you send them now in December because they're too busy thinking about wrapping up the Congress. Holidays are coming up. It might just get buried within other more timely or more recent correspondence. However, it could be good practice to send it now and then send a follow-up early in January, or wait until January, but making sure that you get it out that first or second week of January. Typically, offices are finalizing or confirming the lawmaker schedules about 2 to 3 weeks in advance. So you don't need months and months time of head notice, but the sooner you do it, the better your chances, because maybe there isn't something that's already locked into their schedule already. Other things that you want to look into in January, at least the first half of January, is researching like your member of Congress, what background they have. Do they have any ties to your institution or to any other community college? As you recall, in our previous NLS programs, we always have a list of members of Congress with a community college affiliation, whether it's a former trustee, a former president, a former faculty, someone who received their associate's degree from an institution, or someone who attended and transferred out of it, and so forth. So looking into all of those, maybe it's not the member themselves, maybe it's a family who has attended or participated in a college. All of that is good information to have so that you can build that rapport once you get to the meeting. Look into the history that your institution has, that your board has with that member. Have they met with them before? Have you met with their staff? Have you hosted them at your college? Have you invited them for any ceremonies or graduation? All of that is good information to know so that you can refer that back to those when you meet with them. And then the other thing is looking a little deeper into the actual legislative resume for that legislator. You want to make sure that you're aware of what committees they serve on. For our purposes, the Education and Labor Committee in the House, the Senate Health, Education and Labor, Senate Education, Labor and Pensions Committee, the Help Committee in the Senate, the appropriations committees, especially those that serve on the Labor, Health and Human Services, Education and Related Agencies Subcommittee, in both the House and the Senate. Those are our key primary committees that we look at. Obviously, these are folks who are working very closely on education issues or funding education programs, but those are not the only committees that are of interest to you or that should not be of interest to you. So even if your member is not serving in one of those two committees, there are other committees that may be relevant to you. For example, we're talking about Judiciary Committee. The Judiciary Committees will be doing a lot of work around immigration. And we know that President Trump has talked a lot about having a secure border and having a deportation campaign, which may impact your institutions. So ensuring that if your member is on the Judiciary Committee and that is an issue or an area of concern to you, that you speak to them about it. If members are in the Agriculture Committee, as we've stated, the Farm Bill will be extended again for another year, which means Congress will still be discussing and negotiating on Farm Bill provisions. The Senate Ways and Means Committee is going to be one of the most critical players, Senate Finance or House Ways and Means Committee, because these are the committees that are going to spearhead the tax policy discussions that we alluded to earlier in the presentation. So if tax-free Pell is something you want to continue, want to help us advocate on, those are the folks you want to talk to if they're especially if they sit on those committees and they are your representatives or your senators. Besides that, there's a series of other committees, and your members don't have to sit in one of the ones that are listed here to understand, to have a connection or a point of relevance to your college. The key is finding what is that area of relevance. So a good example on that is the Space Science and Technology Committee in the House is not one that we would think of normally for community college issues. However, they are the ones that could authorize programs under the National Science Foundation that enhance the ability of our institutions to do capacity building on that side. You know, we've talked a lot about over the last several years about chips manufacturing, and you know, with the Chips and Science Act, there's been a lot of activity at our institutions on that sector, and that's one area that the Space Science and Technology Committee may be of interest in. If your representative is on the Defense Committee, then there are cybersecurity programs that our institutions may be running that may be of national interest to your legislator. So it's always just finding that tie-in to make sure that our work is relevant to the lawmakers. And then once we get to February 1, we are very excited to see you all here. And I hope you all bring us good luck and good weather and that it does not snow or it's not too cold for those of us who are from the South. But making sure that you come in prepared for your meeting on the Hill, making sure that you have the right group with you. You know, it should be your president, it should be your board chair, other trustees from your board. Include a student if you're able to bring your students, and if you're able to bring a stakeholder partner, an employer partner to with you, we have found that that is a really good model where the lawmaker gets to hear from all different players, both from within the institution, but also from the community who are benefiting from federal programs that the institution is leveraging. And then once the meeting happens, we have a congressional contact form link here at ACCT. We ask you to please fill it out. It's very simple, and we're mostly asking for what conversations took place during the meeting. What did the member commit to anything? Did the member have any specific questions about any of the policy issues you talked about? Is there a follow-up that we can be helpful in? Filling out this form can help inform our advocacy for the rest of the year. We really appreciate doing that. So we're going to stop there. I'm going to share a couple of reminders and then we will have time for some questions. I know some of you sent some questions during the registration, so we'll take a look at those first. And then in the meantime, if you can put your questions in the Q&A section, and I think we are able to get some already, so we'll get to those as well. But just a couple of reminders, if you haven't already registered for the NLS, we'll share the link to the registration as well. The early bird deadline is next week, Wednesday, December 18th. I encourage you to do that so you can save some money. The deadline to register in our hotel block at the Marriott Marquis is January 15th, but I encourage you to not wait until then and secure your room as soon as you register for NLS. Our block historically tends to sell out, especially over the last couple of years. And we've increased its size, but we tend to sell out. So the sooner you can do it, the better. There are other options, of course. You know, the Marriott Marquis may have other rooms outside of our block. And if not, there are a couple of other hotels in the area that are within walking distance. But if you want to be in the Marquis and you want to get the discounted rate of our block, I encourage you to do it as soon as possible. We will have another webinar at the end of January. This will be one that may be of more interest to more people, and it's the one that where we will unveil our 2025 legislative priorities. That is one that we do right before NLS, and it's because, as I stated, Congress is still working through different policy issues that may or may not need to be included in our legislative priorities. So we won't know what Congress completed until the end of this Congress. And then after that, we need to make sure we go through the proper drafting process and that we know that we provide you the most up-to-date information once you get here. For any questions, please email us. You can email our general public policy email address, or you can email Genesis or I directly. So with that, I'll turn over to questions, but I'm going to pick up some of the simple questions here. Someone asked if we'll be able to access the slide deck after the webinar. Yes, the webinar is being recorded. As soon as we process it, we will add it to the NLS site at nls.acct.org under the resources tab. And under that recording, we will also include a PDF of the slides for your reference. So I think that takes care of the first two questions. So we won't probably email the slides, but they will be on the website once the webinar recording is up. And I would give us maybe just about a week, or at least until the end of this week, to see if we can try to get that on the website for you all. It just takes some time for the video to get processed. I have a really good question regarding a room reservation. For that, I think the rule is that you're not able to reserve a room until after you are registered. However, if you have a specific question on that, please email us an individual situation and I can loop in our director of events, Christina, and she can help us with that and additional details if you're having issues with being able to register now versus having to wait. Great question. As a student trustee, how can I best prepare for NLS? I think one is communicating with your with the rest of your board, communicating with your president, ensuring that you have a coordinated strategy and that you have the information. And as a group, figuring out what are going to be some of the top issues that you want to talk about and where from those issues can you as a student provide the most insightfulness, whether that's personal experience, benefiting from a program like the Pell Grant or um, basic needs grant or anything else that your institution might have that leveraged federal funds. And besides that, if it's not from personal experience, speaking with your peers and just getting a sense from them about how federal programs are benefiting them or what are their needs so that you can communicate that effectively with to your lawmaker when you meet with them and your group. So making sure that you align the messaging with the rest of the team, and then getting examples, direct examples from other students would be very helpful. Highly encourage you to look at some of ACCT's materials from this year, including the 2024 legislative priorities, because that may also give you at least a general sense of some of the issues that we advocate on. I mentioned tax-free Pell. That's something that we'll be talking about next Congress. But we will also be working on the Farm Bill priorities. We'll also be talking on Pell Grants and institutional aid and ensuring that our institutions have the tools and resources they need to help students not only enroll but successfully complete their programs. Um, there's a couple of other questions. This is an interesting question that came from the registrations. What's the best way to secure additional federal funding for my institution, which would support our key initiatives? So I love that question because one of the things you should be talking to your to your lawmakers when you come to NLS, but also before that, if you get the chance, is what is known now as community project funding, or in the Senate, congressionally directed spending. Those are two fancy terms to say earmarks. Earmarks have been back since fiscal year 2022. So at this point, we've gone through 3 cycles of earmarks. And fiscal year 2025, we expect will still include it. Now, fiscal year 2025 is too late for you to try to do that because that process already took place earlier this year in the spring. However, now is the time to start talking with your member of Congress or your senator about including some of your projects in fiscal year 2026, in the earmarks for fiscal year 2026. There may be some changes to how earmarks operate in the next Congress. They made some changes this past year in the House when Republicans took the majority, and they made some restrictions. But our institutions were able, as a whole, to still submit requests in different bills in both the House and the Senate. And so that is probably the best resource that you can leverage right now is trying to work with your member of Congress to secure some direct funding. All other forms of federal grants usually have to go through a competitive, federal funding has to go through a competitive grant process. Um, with earmarks, if you work with your member of Congress and they're able to submit it on your behalf, then it becomes a matter of whether the Appropriations Committee can fit it into their bill. But more often than not, they have been successful, maybe not with the amounts that they originally envisioned, but with some small amounts. So that's one area that I highly encourage you to start thinking about it now. What projects or what initiatives do you currently have on your campus that need additional funding and that you can try to leverage federal funds through earmarks to get to complete that? Um, what other questions? Address the FS.
Jose, sorry for interrupting, but I
Yeah.
don't know if you're able to look at the chat as you talk. I know multitasking can be hard sometimes. So we have a quick question here related to what you were just talking about, which says, you mentioned community project funding and one other. Can you please repeat the name of that funding? So again, can you just like add clarification to what you were mentioning, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And so they're the same thing. It's just that the House named them one thing and the Senate named them another, but they're essentially both earmarks. Community project funding is what the House is calling those member designated funding projects. And in the Senate, it's called congressionally directed spending. But either way, you would want to communicate with the staff, either for your representative or for your senator or both, and start talking about what projects you have in your institution, what initiatives you would like to move forward, that require additional funding, and exploring with them whether that's something that they would be open to submitting as part of their request for fiscal year 2026, and under which bill would that fit. And when I say bill, the Appropriations Committee has 12 bills that they're in charge of, and not all 12 bills accept earmarks, whether it's community project funding or congressionally directed spending. But the ones that do, if they fit, if they qualify under it, they may be able to do it. But that's a conversation that takes several months to put together. And so the sooner you start, the better on that. Other questions? How will agendas for the incoming Trump administration and the Republican Congress affect federal funding for minority serving institutions and NFPCs? That's a great question. It's really one where I'd have to do a crystal ball to give you an answer. My best guess is best case scenario, we fight for level funding. And I think that's going to be the case with most programs out there. Best case scenario, we fight for level funding. If you wanted to take a look at what some of those priorities could look like, it may be worth looking at President Trump's budget request from his first term. And with the caveat that just because it's in the president's budget, it does not mean that it's going to become law. In fact, during his first term, he proposed very, very steep cuts to many programs under the Department of Education. And Congress, the Appropriations Committee, even with a Republican leadership, rejected many of those cuts. So it's good. It's a good lens to see what they were thinking 8 years ago. Looking at the House bill also provides the House bill for this year, for fiscal year 2025, also can provide a good lens. I don't envision them going, hopefully, as steep with their proposals next year, because in part for FY25, the House proposed the steep cuts that way, knowing that the Senate would not accept them. So I think ideally they would move forward with something that is more reasonable on both ends. And like I mentioned in the Senate, with appropriations, they will need some Democratic support, so they can't afford to make such drastic or steep cuts, because then they will not have Democratic votes to pass the bills on the Senate. So this is why I am slightly optimistic that we will not see such drastic cuts as have been proposed in the past. But best case scenario is likely going to be level funding, if not a slight cut in many programs. But if you want to take a look at what their narrative could be as a starting negotiating point, you could look at the prior Trump administration budget request and some of the House majority proposals from FY25 and FY24. There's a request to address the effort to eliminate the Department of Education. I know that has been something that many of you have probably heard in the news, on social media, and so forth. I don't want to belittle the issue. However, I do find it to be a red herring. The Trump administration cannot eliminate the Department of Education with a stroke of a pen. It needs congressional approval. There have been proposals in the past that were introduced, but were mostly, or whether it was standalone legislation or amendments to moving vehicles. But those were mostly messaging efforts, because all they said was eliminated the Department of Education. And that is something, if it were to happen, that one would require multiple years, and two would require for Congress to carefully and explicitly delineate what is happening with every program that the department currently operates. Not everything would be eliminated. For example, there's talk about the federal student aid programs being moved over to the Department of the Treasury. There are conversations about workforce programs, or some programs for community colleges going to the Department of Labor, and so forth. But all of this would take an act of Congress, and even though they have the majority in both chambers, again, they are slight majorities. I'm not entirely sure that everybody in the Republican conference is of the opinion that the department should be eliminated, so I'm not sure that they would have the consensus for it. What I am more concerned is about the capacity of the department. So while the Trump administration cannot eliminate it, they can certainly choose not to fill some vacancies as this happened in his first term, which would then hamstring the department's ability to get grant competitions out or to do rulemaking. So it depends on what they want to do. I don't think we will be seeing the elimination of the department itself, or at least that's my optimistic conjecture. Uh, but we will see some changes to the department through its leadership, through its staffing, through its priorities, and we may see proposals in Congress that change the direction of the Department of Education as well. Um, what is the status of Workforce Pell? That's a great question. So as you recall, this has been a year of a lot of starts and stops and a lot of hope for Workforce Pell. We came to a bipartisan agreement in the House that unfortunately was not able to move to the floor, but that gathered a lot of support. The Senate had a lot of conversations around Workforce Pell. Unfortunately, given the limited number of legislative days that are left and the efforts that they are putting on WIOA, I don't think Workforce Pell would move forward by the end of this Congress. However, we feel optimistic that with the new majorities in Congress and with the Trump administration, there may be a window of opportunity to engage with them and try to have more vocal support on Workforce Pell and to move on a compromise legislation under the new committee leadership. Senator Cassidy, who will be chair of the Help Committee in the Senate, has expressed support for Workforce Pell, and he will be in charge of setting the agenda for the committee in the Senate. The two representatives that are currently in a race for the chairmanship of the Education and Workforce Committee, Representative Wahlberg and Representative Owens, both have publicly expressed support for Workforce Pell as well. And the nominee for the Department of Education, Linda McMahon, wrote an op-ed earlier this fall explicitly expressing support for the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act, which was the bill in the House that had support from both Ranking Member Scott and Chair Fox. So we think there's an opportunity to move that next year, and we think there will be a couple of different legislative vehicles that we can employ. I don't think it will happen by the end of this month, but I think we would be in a good starting point for next Congress. Um,
Jose, I know that you're going through questions. So we have a few about Dreamers and DACA. Is there any information that we can share at this point in regards to that theme of questions?
There really isn't. Unfortunately, we're hoping to have more information for you all once we get to February in NLS. But we have to wait until the start of the new Congress. We have to wait until the January 20th for the president to be inaugurated. I think we can expect some sort of executive action on the first day or on the first week of his administration regarding border security, regarding undocumented folks. As you all know, DACA has been sort of in limbo in the courts, and that has not changed. It's unclear what is going to happen with all that litigation, but as you all know, we have not had new DACA recipients essentially since the first Trump administration. So it's been over 5 years because the Biden administration tried to bring it back and then they were challenged by some states. So they've been able to renew DACA permits for current DACA recipients, but there haven't been any new DACA recipients since the Trump administration, or since the start of the Trump administration. So I unfortunately don't have any information at this time. But we do expect some quick action to happen right before NLS, and we are working on trying to gather information so that we can have some more for you at NLS. One thing that I think we cannot tell you what to do, but that your institutions will have to contend is, and this will be how a state level decision and an institutional decision is how you all choose to engage with ICE and with other federal officials regarding immigration enforcement. That's not something that we can do anything on because it will not be a federal law per se or a federal change per se. We are going to continue supporting and advocating on behalf of our students, on behalf of DACA recipients that are in our campuses, whether as students or as faculty or staff. Will continue advocating for in any conversations that happen around immigration, if there are conversations about immigration reform, advocating for post-secondary education to being a pathway to legal permanent residence and citizenship. Those have been our key points for decades now, and we'll continue doing that. But we unfortunately don't have a lot of information right now, and we don't want to scare anyone, but we also don't want to dismiss the issue because it's something that we'll have to deal with, but we need to see what exactly is being proposed before we can do anything. And recommendations for how administrations can properly and effectively plan the logistics of reserving meetings with the legislature. This is a good question. Um, like I said, you could start doing meeting requests now. I think if you do it in the first week of January, you should be fine. A couple of points on that is that if your state has a system, a governing system, or a state association, they often tend to coordinate these meetings. So make sure you communicate with them and ask them what they're doing so that you don't do double work. If that is not happening, we do have on nls.acct.org a couple of resources and materials, such as a sample email template for your scheduler. If you are having issues getting the contact information for your elected officials scheduler or their staff, we're happy to help with that, providing that so that you can reach out to them. And I think providing details and specifics would be helpful. If you have had meetings with either their legislative assistants here in DC or their outreach staff in the district, copying those folks in the email that you send to the scheduler is helpful so that they know that it's not a cold email, it's someone who has a prior relationship with the committee. Members of Congress like to get a list of potential attendees and to know who of them are their constituents. So highlighting that would be beneficial. And then, of course, including the specific topics that you'd like to talk about can help them assign the proper staff to be in the meeting with the elected official as well. In terms of making sure that you can get a meeting, the sooner you get that request in, the better. And then don't expect a response right away. Like if you were to send one now in mid-December, you might not hear until January, but it would be a good opportunity to then send a follow-up in January, and then making sure that you send a follow-up leading up to it. So on that last week of January, to make sure that everything is confirmed, that all the details are good. The other thing to mention is that these are legislative days. There are votes scheduled on the floor. There are committee meetings and committee activities happening. So you hopefully will be meeting with the elected official, but sometimes that may not happen. And if you're meeting with their staff, do not diminish that meeting, because at the end of the day, the staff is the one that is advising the member of Congress, and they're the ones that are doing the actual policy work to get priorities. When we talk about earmarks, for example, we were talking earlier in the webinar, it is not the member of Congress that is going one by one through all of those requests. It's their staff who is going through those requests and determining which of those are the ones that they are going to advise the members submit. So that relationship is very important as well. But as long as you can get your request in by early January, I think you should be in good shape. sending a follow-up, you don't necessarily need to call right away, but if you send an email and you haven't received a confirmation of that they received their meeting request, or you haven't heard anything as we get towards the end of January, making a call is a good idea. Schedulers have a lot on their plate. They have to manage the senators or the elected officials' entire schedule, and so sometimes things slip through the crack, and making sure that you're on top of it can help them stay on top of it as well. And I think that's
Well, and I was gonna say, Jose, so for everyone's reference in the chat, I put a link to one of the resources that we have on acct.com. Um, and it pretty much goes through scheduling meetings and tips and suggestions, and it's just a resource.
there is one more question, and I think this is a good one to end with. What advice would you give presidents and trustees in terms of preparing their colleges for likely outcomes of the new administration? Um, I think there are some opportunities that we can leverage going into the new administration and the new Congress. I think I've mentioned a couple of them. Obviously, tax policy is going to be a big thing next year. It may be our best chance to try to get tax-free Pell across the finish line. Um, there is a lot of negative opinions around higher education over the last couple of years, especially from some people in the majority in the House. But a lot of that has been geared towards our peers in the four-year sector and our peers in the highly selective four-year sector. Our sector, for the most part, is still seen overall positive, and we do still have overall bipartisan support. So I think it's just a matter of finding the areas of commonality, whether that's pivoting more to the work we do on workforce development or pivoting from speaking around DEI and equity to making sure that as open access institutions, we have the tools that we need to serve all students from all walks of life, and highlighting the students that we're serving, from young teenagers that are doing dual enrollment all the way to adult breadwinners who are trying to reskill or upskill because they've had a transition in their job or because they are forced to get a new job, to everything in between, from folks who are trying to get adult basic education to folks who are going back to school for their associates because they need it for a better economy, for a better economic situation, and so forth. The breadth of students that we serve, I think, is our strength, and highlighting that and aligning that with the narrative that the majority in the House and the Senate will have, and the narrative that the Trump administration will have, I think can still position us in a way that we can support our students and get some benefit. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, and it's hard to do that when the majority is proposing major cuts because of financial concerns to the federal deficit. Uh, but even when that happens, as a good example, even in the House fiscal year 2025 bill, even though across the board it's really bad for the Department of Education and there are some major cuts, we were able to maintain funding for strengthening community college training grants. And we were able to get a small $5 million increase to the Strengthening Institutions program. So even while the narrative is happening, there's still small areas of opportunities. And as long as we can get the narrative correctly and make them see the importance of our programs, it may help us in supporting our students and our institutions. So with that, I will stop. Thank you all for joining us. I know it's been a long webinar, but we hope to see you next year in February. And we're here if you have any questions. Like I said, you can reach out to us through public policy at acct.org. And be on the lookout for any new developments and news regarding NLS and any future webinars we may be having. Thank you, everyone.